Right, well, first with the usual warnings to extinguish or put on silent your mobile phones before Stephen gets started. And secondly, there is, as I understand it, at least no fire alarm scheduled. So if the fire alarm does go off, then do please follow our RUSI staff in an orderly fashion towards the exits. And Peter and Ewan are sitting in the front row for that and other purposes at the moment. It's my great pleasure to welcome Stephen Lovegrove, the Permanent Under-Secretary in the Ministry of Defence, here to talk about managing the Ministry of Defence. Stephen's been in this position now, I think, since April 2016. You will have seen his biography. And I think one of the great benefits of coming from and having a range of senior positions in other government departments and in the private sector is that he must realise how unique the Ministry of Defence is as an institution in so many ways, something which perhaps some of the longer-term inhabitants of the defence field sometimes forget, and it's helpful, I think, given the challenges the Ministry of Defence has, to be aware of the uniqueness, because that perhaps helps us clarify the nature of the problems going ahead. Stephen joined, of course, in April 2016 at a time after the 2015 election, after the 2015 SDSR, and before the vote on Brexit. So perhaps when you joined, you thought you could look forward to a period of majority government and simply get on with the job of delivering the results of the review with which you were presented. But life's not been quite like that in the last period. And people in defence like to talk about adaptability and thriving on uncertainty. And certainly the Ministry of Defence has been doing a bit of that in recent months, dealing with the aftermath of what I think it is now universally acknowledged was an overcommitted 2015 SDSR, made worse by the growing short-term cost of the Dreadnought programme and by the sterling devaluation after the Brexit vote. Never mind quite a lot of things happening in the wider world that's very relevant to defence and security. And most recently, of course, the decision to split off the defence element of the National Security Capability Review and launch a separate defence programme. So I'm sure Stephen will touch on many of those themes. I've heard him before, an engaging and interesting speaker as ever. This event will be on RUSI rules, so the presentation itself will be on the record and indeed on camera and I think, being live streamed by RUSI. And then the questions and answers will be strictly off the record. So, Stephen, over to you.
Thank you, Malcolm, for that kind introduction and also the invitation to speak here today. And you're right, I wasn't anticipating some of the things that have happened in the last 2 years to have been in my in tray as they have come about. But at least I'm not in a completely Brexit-facing department, so I'm happy about that. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, a lot has changed since 1975, some of it even at the Ministry of Defence, but plenty still holds true. In 1975, you invited one of my distinguished predecessors, Sir Michael Carey, to this very hall to speak to you on exactly the same subject as I am speaking today. And he told your, not contemporaries from that day, he told the audience that day that in a democracy, the view of what can be afforded for defence as opposed to other claimants on resources should be in direct proportion to the threat. The current perception is, at best, somewhat dim. Today, I'd like to talk about the management of the MOD in that context, shaping our capabilities in what is inevitably a resource-constrained environment, but critically doing so against the contemporary threat, rather than those threats that we might have found more familiar, even if they were never comfortable. Everyone in defence, everyone in this room, knows how important it is that we get that right. But with claims on resources and attention as insistent today as they have ever been, it is vital that we engage not just our sector, but as wide a public as we can reach. And today's event is part, but only part, of that. Right now, of course, the focus is clearly on the modernising defence programme that we announced in January, and that will be the main topic of my remarks today. No doubt you will have many questions about it, but I would be surprised if the first one was not, why are we doing this again? In answering that, let's go back to the Strategic Defence and Security Review of 2015. You will remember that we identified 4 areas of challenge: the evolution of extreme terrorism, the resurgence of state-based threats, including an increasingly assertive Russia, and the irresponsibly dangerous activities of North Korea, the rapid advance of technology on all fronts, and the erosion of the rules-based international order. That analysis still stands, and the SDSR was recognised as a strong review, both here and overseas. But it is unarguable to me that the pace of change in the last 3 of these has quickened alarmingly. 2 examples from last week alone. President Putin's State of the Nation address was a stark example of a darkening geopolitical picture, replete with new and dangerous weaponry, while HMS Sutherland's current deployment is a powerful reminder of the UK's commitment to the principle of freedom of navigation. But a further development is that I think we are also seeing a radical and alarming commingling of all of those 4 elements, which we did not see in 2015. There's a cross-contamination of risk which greatly magnifies the dangers which any one of them poses on its own. Examples: we're seeing regional powers developing nuclear capabilities with global reach for avowedly non-regional deterrence. We're seeing the taboo on chemical weapons flouted more regularly than we have been used to by rogue states today, not to mention ongoing efforts by extremists to acquire chemical and biological weapons. We are seeing extremely sophisticated missile technology in the hands of non-state actors being used against national armed forces. We're seeing proxy warfare, which of course has been with us forever, becoming, though, the new normal, and deniability becoming the standard modus operandi. We're seeing the possibility of conventional defence platforms being severely compromised by new weapon systems. And finally, we're seeing cyber activity, which is both difficult to attribute and much less easy to target than you, and certainly I, would expect state actors to demand. The comparatively indiscriminate damage caused by NotPetya is a good recent example. In the words of January's US defence strategy, the views of which we very much endorse in the UK, we now live in a multipolar environment subject to sweeping changes, instability, and unpredictability. And I hope I am wrong, but the long period of successful non-proliferation regimes the globe has enjoyed since the end of the Second World War looks to be in more danger than it ever has been, and its impairment is unlikely to be reversible. Most of us in this room are well aware of that strategic landscape, but a better and much wider understanding of it and the shifting challenges we face will allow us to make better choices over where we want to and need to invest. The National Security Capability Review will give us a clearer, up-to-the-minute picture of the hazards we face and the vulnerabilities we need to address, which I'm sure will be read with great interest when it's published, and it needs to be debated widely. But we don't need to wait that long to see what we have to do in defence. Given the challenges we're facing, some, but by no means all, financial, delay is not an option. And globally, we're not the only ones to have reached that conclusion. A number of our allies have taken a good look at defence over the last couple of years. I've mentioned the United States already, but you could add France, Poland, Germany and Italy. And I'm not long back from India, where I listened intently to the descriptions of their new Joint Armed Forces doctrine. These documents all have a couple of things in common. They all committed their countries to new capabilities in a changed strategic landscape, and they all recognise that regularly updating their strategic reviews is an inescapable consequence of the pace of events. As our French allies said in theirs late last year, the fast-changing international context inevitably imposes timely reviews of our defence strategy. I agree very strongly with that. Clearly, we will need to avoid the danger of chopping and changing in a way that makes long-term planning an impossibility. But nevertheless, it points in two directions, I think. Firstly, in the preference for investment in adaptable, modular, and ideally evergreen platforms, with organisational structures adapted to iterative approaches to capability development. And secondly, in taking a leaf from other countries' books, by cultivating a debate about the threat picture which is prior to and informs final choices on force structure and equipment. Which brings us to the Modernising Defence Programme, NDP. Looking at its four strands in a little more detail, the first is the defence operating model. The second, efficiency and business modernisation. The third, our commercial and industrial approach. And the fourth is defence policy, outputs, and military capability. The first three are essentially designed to reform the way that the department works, interacts with itself and its supplier base, and to allow us to maximise benefit on behalf of the taxpayer and the armed forces. All strands must work to eradicate bureaucracy and risk avoidance. All must look to boost coherence and speed and be responsive to the demands of the front line. To take these first three in turn, the defence operating model. Since 2010 and Levine, we have been on a journey of delegation, one which I fully support and has brought immense strides in the effectiveness and accountability of the front line. But the implementation of the Levine model, however, has not been perfect. While the frontline commands have developed muscle mass, the centre has lost some. Jointery is overwhelmingly, obviously, the most important principle by which the services mount operations. But before we ever get to that point, there are disjunctions and incongruities between the services that we simply cannot afford. The centre, a strong centre, is necessarily the answer to that. As envisaged in Levine, it needs to be strategic, fully knowledgeable, and where necessary, directive. We need the capability to husband and steward resources in accordance with the strategic picture developed by and working hand in glove with colleagues across the rest of Whitehall. At the moment, the centre, in my opinion, is not consistent or uncompromising enough to do that, and we cannot expect the single services and other top-level budget holders to do our job for us. We have bulked up our senior leadership in the centre, and it is already paying dividends. A chief operating officer who can sit on the single service boards, building the interconnective tissue and driving accountability. A chief information officer who can draw together the extremely complex and extremely expensive threads of our networks which can be both vulnerabilities and battle-winning capabilities. A Director General of Nuclear who can holistically oversee the immense national endeavour of renewing our deterrent, both the weapon systems and the platforms, as well as its protection. These are all important and necessary steps in improving the cohesion of UK defence and making sure that we place our resources where we need them. And you can expect further reorganisation in the department as the year progresses. Number two, efficiency is clearly linked to the operating model, as indeed both are to number three, our commercial strand. I have been very honest in the past that the department, like all Whitehall departments, faces some extremely challenging efficiency targets, ones that stretch far into the future and demand of us a different way of meeting them. But we have to recognise that the efficiency campsite we inhabit at the moment has become too crowded and too untidy. At least 4 different efficiency programmes have been adopted by the department in the last 8 years, and the dangers of double counting and confusion are apparent on a daily basis. We need to urgently untangle those knots and own, right across defence, a consolidated and realistic picture of what we can do. I want that picture to be at the very edge of arduous and exacting. It must be to keep faith with the taxpayer. But I want it to be stable and consistent too, capable of iterative but not unmanageable adjustment, with governance that is fit to the task. Our third strand, commercial engagement, sees our most important partners playing their part. With Defence Equipment and Support, we have much to do here, streamlining first our own processes so that the curse of contract adjustment is eliminated as much as possible, and sustaining investment in important supply chains where we know that failure to do so will lose time, money, and the sovereign capability that we need. That is work for defence. But it is an obvious truism, but no less true for that we need our partners to work with us. We need radical and sustained improvements in productivity in some of our biggest facilities and projects, improvements that only industry can deliver. We must not let monopsony habits persist in our relationships. I want to be very clear. In the current climate, overruns can only be met with cancellations somewhere else in the programme. Our suppliers need to be as committed and as imaginative to continuous improvement as we will demonstrate ourselves to be. I want a thriving British defence sector as much as they, and achieving it requires nothing less. We also want to work more closely with industry in pursuit of increased export success, recognising the challenges of operating in a more complex, competitive and ever-changing environment. Exports, like conflict, need to be a whole-of-government exercise, a partnership of government and industry. Finally, Strand 4, defence policy, outputs and military capability. In a sense, this is the conventional extension of the work that we did under the National Security Capability Review of last year, identifying opportunities for modernising our military capability, making defence better able to make a full and sustainable contribution to national security objectives. It is where the most difficult questions, separate from those relating to the reform of the department, must find their answers. Where are we placing our big bets? Surely it makes sense to concentrate on areas which play to the UK's strengths, both traditional, of course, but emerging ones too, like laser and other directed energy weapons, cyber, both defensive and offensive, the latter to work as a weapon and as a deterrent, electronic warfare, and simulated training techniques. Some of these choices are not going to be easy. I was going to plagiarise something that Professor Chalmers wrote earlier in the year, but I thought it might be more honest just to quote him. The more radical, he wrote, the commitment to the rapid fielding of new, disruptive technologies, the less useful the traditional measures of military capability become as indicators of national military power. That statement is true, and it begs the question I started with. How can we move the public debate towards such a frank and necessary recognition of threats and possibilities? I think it would help if we aren't too prescriptive at the start of our discussion. That's why public debate is built into our programme. A programme, as the Secretary of State has said, is designed to deliver headline findings in time for the NATO summit in July. I want a wide and open consultation and mature conversations with the armed forces, with industry, with international partners, with defence commentators, and with the public. Conversations which don't shy away from the central questions of what we as the United Kingdom want from defence as we embark on a new and different leg of our national journey. And that starts with a disciplined and informed conversation about what we want to defend against. Thank you.
Would you like to sit?